All right. Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your favorite conservatarian and contrarian, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. Got another fire conversation for you guys today. We're going to talk about some more stuff that's kind of been in the news over the past couple years, and I think you guys are going to get a lot out of this. But before we get into everything, you already know what to do. You already know what to do. You got to like this. You got to share this. Subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. Hit that subscribe button. Hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard. Also want to remind you that LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Check out LibertyNation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles and analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio, which I host, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback. Now, to the subject at hand, which is going to be equity. We all love that word, don't we? We've been hearing a lot about equity, and I have with me the executive director of the American Civil Rights Project, Mr. Dan Morenoff. If I can get this right. There we go.
Great.
How you doing today, sir?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate the chance.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a good time here. I think you have a very interesting perspective, but not just that. I think I read your article in Newsweek, and it's really helpful as far as understanding what equity means, especially equity versus equality. A lot of people they'll talk about it, but they won't actually break it down the way you did. So I'm looking forward to going through that with you. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer, and the American Civil Rights Project, the ACR project, as we call it, it's a public interest law firm that seeks to assure that all Americans' shared civil rights are protected. We really view it as our job to make sure that equality in the law, under the law, is preserved, especially against the challenge from so-called equity and those pushing it as an alternative.
Okay, yes, okay. So I didn't realize it was a law firm. So do you represent, like, say, if somebody's being discriminated against, you represent them? Is that kind of what you do, or is it something different?
Yeah, yes, in a way. We're looking for ways to address these issues in the biggest, most systematic ways we can, that hopefully are, leveraging the resources available to us to have the biggest payback. But that's what we're doing. We're representing individuals, organizations in fighting against the woke mandates and policies that are out there pushing fashionable discrimination.
Okay, and it sounds like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like along with that, you seem like you do like a lot of advocacy on this regard too, like even outside of the courtroom. It seems like you're really intent on getting the word out about this stuff and educating people on what it is. Would that be fair to say too?
I mean, an important part of what we're doing is trying to get people as a whole to understand where the law actually is and why it's there, so that people can appreciate and make use of the fact that an intergenerational agreement of Americans over decades or centuries is on their side in standing for equality and equal treatment in your daily life and in the law.
Okay. So here's my question right off the bat. I mean, even when I saw your organization, American Civil Rights Project, Dan, they passed the civil rights law in the 60s. If I apply at a company, they can't discriminate against me because I'm Black. They're not allowed to do that. If they do that, they get in trouble. Why are we talking about civil rights in 2022? Like that, hasn't this already been established?
Yeah, you'd think, right? And one of the main laws that we've been making use of is actually from the Civil Rights. It's a part of a statute. It's actually from the Civil Rights Act of 1866.
Okay.
So it's 100 years older, and we're still fighting about this because, to be honest, there are people who either simply want to ignore the law or want to misrepresent the law. in order to allow them or justify them in doing things that frankly are flatly illegal and often unconstitutional.
So okay, so we've seen over the past couple of years, especially with the whole woke movement, after the murder of George Floyd, that got very much exploited by the far left. And in your article, you write about a racial reckoning of 2020, and you said that it led our elites to decide that they know better, which that's kind of what elites do, and they decided that fairness is a result, not a process. Now, what does that mean?
Sure. So, and by the way, they're not the first people to make this argument. Like, there have always been people who have made this argument. I can talk about one of the older examples that I like, which is, by the way, why I'm going to refer to this throughout as so-called equity, because one, it isn't equitable, and two, it's not equity. Like, it's not consistent with our laws, and it's also not an accurate label, but it is the label that's being used. So, we got to live with it. I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought there. What was the question you had me answering?
Yeah, so you said that these elites, they decided that fairness is a result, not a process.
Right. So there have always been those who, in opposition to the very long-term consensus of the American people, which I would describe as we want to be treated equally. In the article, I said that this has been our law since 1866, or I'm quite sure Lincoln would have said since the Declaration in the 1770s, right? All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. We know this language, right? So, sorry, that was a rhetorical question. I know you know that. It's a bad habit of mine. Right. And yet there have always been people, and there have been people in the English-speaking world centuries earlier who hate the idea of everyone being equal before the law and prefer this concept of, it now calls itself equity. And what it looks for is everyone treated the same? It's, does everyone emerge in the same place? Or not even does everyone, because that's never going to be the case. But does every group of people in groupings that the authors care about, right? Like, so if they can break us into segments and measure us in those separate sections, that's what they want to talk about. And are we emerging in the same place? In the 1600s in England, there was a movement that pushed expressly for this. They were called the Levelers. The Levelers played a big role in the English Civil War. They were on the side of Parliament, the people that beheaded the king. And then in the Commonwealth, what the Levelers wanted to do, interestingly, was to, look, equity is a term that's been around for 1,000 years. There have been English-speaking equity courts for 1,000 years. And, 600 plus years into that, the Levelers wanted to abolish equity. Why? Because equity was where everyone would be treated the same. And if everyone was treated the same, you wouldn't emerge with everyone leveled, everyone having the same thing at the end of the day. So they literally tried to abolish the courts of equity as the place where equality was most served in the English system. And Oliver Cromwell's Parliament said, no, that's ridiculous. That's insane. It isn't what we want. So, this isn't a new fight.
Right.
It isn't a new fight. It isn't equity, but it is what they want, which is this to replace a process of treating everyone the same way, of standard rules, of standard thresholds, and replace it with active discrimination against the people who would do too well under a rule of equal treatment. To be honest, that always makes me think of, like, and I didn't mention this in the article, right? But of the Kurt Vonnegut short story, Harrison Bergeron. Like, I don't know if you've read this. I had it on an exam in middle school, I think. But it's this great short story where there's a future dystopian regime that, in order to make sure everyone emerges leveled, shackles those who are particularly talented. Kurt Vonnegut was no fire-breathing conservative, right? But
right.
You don't need to be to understand why that's a dystopian nightmare. That's not a model. And yet here we are.
So it sounds almost like this is like a fancier way of saying equality of outcome, because you always have the equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Is this kind of the same thing, or is there a difference that I'm missing?
No, that's totally right. There are any number of stupid meme versions trying to justify the equity worldview, most of which wind up having like 3 kids watching a baseball game with boxes looking over a fence.
Yes.
You've seen this, right? Like, yes, that's the entire goal here is equality of outcomes. By the way, my favorite version of that is the one that says, equality, equity, and property rights, where the fence has simply been extended higher because you haven't paid to get in and you shouldn't be watching this game. Mm-hmm. But that's a different issue entirely.
Yeah, that would affect everybody trying to look over the fence. Yeah. So, because there's a lot to what you just said there. And this is stuff that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as I see where things are going with these companies and our schools and stuff like that. Now, you mentioned the way these people see it is that you write in your article, there's this quote, they decided that fairness requires active discrimination against those who would do too well under equal treatment. And what's fair is whatever it takes to produce matching results for disparate groups. It's funny because this is stuff that I know, but when you put it that way, it sounds so dangerous to me.
Yes.
What are some of the dangers that you see with that? I think anybody can think of any, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Sure. Look, on maybe a top tier level, it's basically immoral to treat different people differently because of their immutable characteristics, right? Mm-hmm. Again, this is the consensus we've had for at least 160 years. We obviously didn't live up to it earlier than that, even if it was aspirationally what we believed in. So, you can start with that. You can look at some of the particular places where this has played out to start to see exactly how dangerous it is, right? Like you've got, here, I'll give a medical example. Okay. There are a bunch of different localities which over the course of the pandemic decided to play around with equity-based racial allocations of treatment. Right. So early on, you had at least 3 jurisdictions kick around whether or not they were going to allocate the first available sets of COVID vaccines on the basis of race. Right. We wrote several of those. 2 of the 3 I know backed down: Montgomery County, Maryland, Vermont. No, sorry, Vermont didn't back down. Vermont, by the way, Vermont did not back down, but Vermont is so uniform in its demography that the total number of people affected over 15 days that their preference was involved was literally about less than 20,000 people. That's a rounding error in any major city as to, who was vaccinated in a single day. So, I live in Dallas, Texas. Dallas literally was vaccinating that number of people at a single location in Fair Park.
Yeah.
In a single day. So, Oregon was also considering this and backed down. Later, you had New York, Utah, and Minnesota all decide that they were going to allocate the availability of the medicines for treating those with serious infections on the basis of race, because they wanted to fix health disparities across the population as a whole that had nothing to do with COVID. They felt like there were too many elderly people with serious conditions of the wrong race who were surviving. So they wanted to reallocate medicines to make sure that more would die. If that doesn't immediately facially tell you what's wrong, like this is literally something out of like a nightmare retelling of apartheid. Of hospitals refusing to give care to people because of their race. That should be chilling.
Because you need the right people to die.
Because if someone's going to die, we need to massage the numbers so that they wind up balancing out differently. There's also a hospital that's part of the Harvard system that had ran a two-part study analyzing 10 years of its data over where it assigns people with heart failures. It's Brigham and Women. It's the Brigham and Women's. There's an apostrophe S there. Brigham and Women's determined that over 10 years, they were assigning people who came in with heart failures to either their cardiology group or general medicine, and that there was no basis, there was no consistent explanation for where people were assigned. Nothing like, severity of illness, nothing like ability to pay, not even that. They didn't have that as a fallback. They determined that the only thing that actually seemed to predict where people were sent was whether they engaged in self-advocacy loudly and long enough to be put into cardiology. Because, by the way, they also determined that the cardiology ward got much better results and was much more comfortable. And while they didn't state it, I will guarantee you that being treated by the specialists in the more comfortable facility with single rooms was also much more expensive for the institution. So what did they do? They having analyzed this, having determined that all of this was the case, because they're run by the woke administrators that they are, they then looked at, well, what's the racial and ethnic makeup of the people who self-advocate most loudly and longly until they're put into the better system. And you believe it or not, Massachusetts has a lot more white Karens than African Americans or Hispanics, and that as a result, there was a marked disparity in who was getting better treatment and who was getting worse treatment and worse results. Now that's a problem. It certainly is. I would have assumed that when you ran that study, what you'd come out of it and do would be to create some sort of policy that would assure that anyone who came in while there was room in cardiology got sent to cardiology because it's better and it's the best care you can give to the person. And if that's full, then maybe you need to, once it's full, maybe you need to have a rule for how your I'm blanking on the word from MASH, right? Like how you're determining triage, who's getting the better care, who's going to the other place. And it should probably turn on, severity of conditions, how many compounding other illnesses should you have?
Yeah, who needs it the most? Yeah.
This would be where it would go. It isn't. Instead, they decided what they needed to do was put in an administrative nudge so that when someone came in that the doctor admitting decided was either Black or Hispanic, they would specifically have a checkbox to analyze whether to think about, have you considered whether to send this person to cardiology? I think that's remarkable. It's remarkable to me that their answer to this systematic provision of less good care than they could provide was to say all we need to do is to try to massage the numbers so that the people that we're sending to the less good care because it's more profitable look more like the total population of patients. Like if that's the piece of this that you think is wrong, I can't help you.
Yeah, I mean that's so goofy. Like it defies common sense. I mean, because common sense says you prioritize those who need the most, who are the sickest, who are closest.
I would agree.
Yeah. Well, what other institutions are they pushing this stuff in? I mean, you mentioned the medical, but I mean, it sounds like there's a lot that maybe.
No, there is. This is a very target-rich environment. Like almost anywhere you look, you can find major institutions hijacked by ideologues pushing this, right? So there are school boards nationwide that are altering the admissions policies for their magnet schools to get rid of excess Asians who keep qualifying under neutral tests, right? So that's going to sort of at the Supreme Court, sort of at the Fourth Circuit about the Fairfax schools and Thomas Jefferson. It's also in the courts in Boston and their magnets, San Francisco and theirs, New York City and its best public schools. All of these have that same story going. You could look instead at efforts to massage who's sitting on corporate boards. You could look at the laws that a California state court has just ruled are unconstitutional, allocating board seats on the basis of race, ethnicity, sex.
I remember that.
Ability status. Right. But those statutes are there, and they were passed despite the fact that the legislative staff told the legislature, this is almost surely unconstitutional, and they did it anyway. You could go with those. You could go with NASDAQ having changed its listing requirements to either require that listed companies have what they NASDAQ think is a sufficiently diverse board, again, scored by race, ethnicity, sex, gender, disability status. NASDAQ, in order to actually make that change, because NASDAQ is a regulated exchange, they needed the SEC to authorize them. The SEC did authorize them almost exclusively because it was the change in listing requirements had been asked for by BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and Fidelity. If you want to know who the largest institutions pushing this are, it's them. But because 4 groups of investment shops in New York wanted it, the SEC said yes. That's in litigation at the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans, I guess. You could jump instead to accreditors, where, by the way, every university accreditor, there are lots of accreditors out there that are ticking off, is this a school that's eligible for federal money, including the student loan program. All of those accreditors are monopolies granted by the Department of Education. So this is affirmatively a government authorized group. Look, I have not comprehensively read up on this. I can tell you the ABA is currently working on changing its
you mentioned the bar association
for the law schools to require discrimination in admissions, discrimination in hiring. They're doing that, but again, I want you to think about that, right? Like, I'm going off on a tangent. I'm sorry, but like,
no, you're fine. You're fine.
The Harvard and UNC case that's currently at the Supreme Court about both of their use of race in admissions, whether it violates the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the guiding case that's at issue now, whether or not it should be overturned, in Grutter from 2003, the Supreme Court said, you know what, we're going to defer to the educational judgment of teachers and educators at universities that it makes a material difference to the education provided to all students, whether or not there is a diverse student body measured, yes, by race and by lots of other things. It's not just race. That's more or less, I'm summing up Grutter, right? There's a lot that we could talk about that's wrong there, but just take it at face value for a moment. Mm-hmm. If that's what they did, in deference to Grutter, the ABA has now ordered every law school in the country to discriminate on the basis of race, and particularly on the basis of race in admissions, in order to achieve the benefits of diversity. So in deference to the Supreme Court's deference to educators' educational judgments, the accreditors have barred the educators from exercising any judgment at all. If that's not obviously a feedback loop that's particularly dangerous, I don't know what is. And you could go on. There are corporations that have very large corporations. Some of the corporations most associated with America have adopted these kinds of discriminatory policies. Just top of my head, I'll flag a handful that I've written to. Coca-Cola, they backed down. Lowe's, JP Morgan Chase, Starbucks, McDonald's. It's this, again, this is basically anywhere you want to look for it. And it's a question from my perspective of finding who is not only doing it, but is so proud of the fact that they're doing these things that are illegal that they want to tell us about it.
Yes, and that's what I don't get. How are they getting away with it? I mean, because like you said, they're bragging about this, and it seems to me very clearly illegal. So, do they expect to get away with it, or are they getting away with it? Like, how are they able to do this?
Right. I mean, I think the shortest answer there is that they think they'll get away with it either because they're somehow under the misguided understanding of that Grutter case that diversity trumps all law, so that as long as you say you're discriminating for a good cause, it's legal. That's not right. The Supreme Court's told us that's not right many times. And yet here we are. Or if it's not that, they think they can get away with it because no one withstanding will ever challenge them. And for that, let me just point out, by the way, we didn't even talk about all of the things that have been enjoined that the federal government is doing, right? But I mean, just set that aside a minute.
Wow.
if you're just talking about the corporations, think about why they think no one is going to sue them, right? So as an example, JP Morgan Chase. JP Morgan Chase has set up a series of policies for its suppliers under which it's discriminating on the basis of the race of ownership of its suppliers. And it's not only discriminating at what it calls the first tier, it's discriminating at what it calls the second tier of suppliers, so that it requires its suppliers to report to it the diversity of the ownership of their vendors, so that JP Morgan Chase can then tell its suppliers, you must discriminate on the basis of race and other factors, and change who your suppliers are so that we can then take credit for you doing so.
Yeah, there's tier 1 and tier 2 supplier diversity. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. Yeah. And if you think about that, like, who has standing to complain about what JP Morgan Chase is doing? The most obvious answer is the suppliers who are being discriminated against, and not the second tier ones, because they'd be going after the first tier supplier, not after JP Morgan Chase, but the middle one. So only the people let's be serious. JP Morgan Chase is almost always going to be the largest client of anyone.
Yeah.
Right. So put yourself in the shoes of that first tier vendor. If you're told, hey, we're going to discriminate against you, and we're going to discriminate against you even more unless you discriminate against other people, how do your incentives work out? Do you have any incentive to complain right then?
Nope.
I'm going to suggest you don't. I'm going to suggest that if you say anything about it, you have seen your last purchase order, and that instead, if you just stay quiet and don't draw any attention to it, you might not be the guy they throw out the window to massage their first tier numbers. So I think you've got a lot of that. I think you've got a lot of institutions just counting on the fact that they're basically holding people hostage, and they haven't thought through there are other people in the system that can also do something about it.
Yeah.
We are, on behalf of other people in the system, doing something about it. But nonetheless, I think
there's just so many ways in which this stuff goes wrong and causes so much harm. Like, I'm thinking about even like the education system, and I see a lot of schools saying, oh, we're going to get rid of honors classes or valedictorians, or we're going to lower standards to make things more equitable for Black children. Meanwhile, Black children are graduating without the skills, the reading skills and the mathematical skills that they need to survive. So it doesn't even do anything. It doesn't ensure any kind of good outcome. It almost like it just makes people feel good, but you're really causing a lot of harm. I mean, I was just talking to Kay Heimowitz, and she wrote an article about how this works out in education and how this results in disparate outcomes for Black students. And teachers are being asked, what did you do to promote equity in your classroom this school year? And she would like them to be able to say, you know what? I made sure that my Black students knew how to read up to proficiency level, and that's what I did. But that's not how these people think. No. And when I'm hearing you talk about this stuff, even from the beginning, these people, they want to create a good outcome by bringing certain people down.
Correct.
But not instead of lifting certain people up. So instead of, like, say, if there's a disparity between Black children and white children, they're going to bring the white children down instead of elevating Black children up to that level. So it's like, even with like the health disparities when it comes to the COVID, we want the right people to die. Well, there are health disparities, and there's a long history of that. Instead of making sure that more white people die, why not address those health disparity issues and the underlying factors to get Black people more healthier so that they're more on an even ground?
Right. And by the way, let me just point out that, like, you could absolutely do that. And you could do that if we take seriously all of the analysis, and there's a lot of analysis that says that there are, in fact, these kinds of disparities in various fields, right? If you take seriously all of that research, then you could and should craft a policy to achieve a better result that is non-discriminatory, race neutral, right? Like, if it's true that there are groups that have a baseline risk of heart attack that's higher, greater risk of diabetes,
Mhm.
It would be very easy to say, okay, so we're going to do things for people at risk of diabetes. And would that have a
There
disparate
you
impact?
go.
Yes, it would. And that would be fine because you're not discriminating on the basis of race. You're just trying to help people who are at risk. And it would be everyone who is at risk. Or, you were talking about education. Like, I know that, I think it was Oregon that announced that for this school year, they were no longer going to require that seniors be literate in order to graduate. And they said, see, it's racial equity. How is that racial equity? How are
Because everybody's equally dumb.
students?
That's how, Dan. Everybody is equally dumb. That's the outcome.
It's a horrible result. It's a horrible result. And like the fact that anyone would even conceptualize that they've done something good by saying, great, we're throwing kids out of school and we won't teach them anymore because they've graduated when we know they're illiterate is insane.
When I was talking to Kay, she told me this story. There was a lawsuit against the city of Detroit for the school program. One person sued. It was a black student. He graduated with honors from the high school in Detroit, got into community college, ended up on academic probation because he still didn't have the skills he needed to keep up with the other students. He graduated with honors and he didn't know how to read at the level that he needed to read at. Of course they're filing a lawsuit. I mean, that's equity right there. So it's almost like this just makes people feel good. But in the end, you are destroying people's lives.
Well, I hope I'm not, but yes,
no, they are. No, that's the royalty. I'm talking about these people who believe in this stuff.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, I mean, I know we've got time issues here. So last question. So where do you see this whole battle going? Do you think that, time is on our side on this, or do you think that these woke corporations are going to get what they want, or is it going to eventually crumble? Get your crystal ball out and tell me where you think this is going.
I think biggest picture, no, they are not going to get away with it, and no, they are not going to win. And I'm going to leave you with that optimistic thought with a little bit of a justification, right? You can see this very clearly because it's been pulled for decades in discussions of race-based admissions to colleges. It appears that when she wrote Grutter, Justice O'Connor believed that there was a national consensus in favor of race-based admissions. And if she so believed, she was very wrong. In 1991, I'm a decade off. I'm sorry. In 2001, sorry, I misstated that. In 2001, the Washington Post polled what was support for race-based admissions, and they discovered that they didn't break this down as many ethnic groups as pollsters now do. There's been some demographic change in America over the last 20 years that probably explains that. They discovered that over 90% of white Americans polled were opposed to race-based admissions, and over 85% of Black Americans polled were opposed to race-based admissions. Yes.
Really?
Yes. From 1993 to 2003, there was overwhelming opposition. There's a scholar who I've cited to, and I'm blanking on his name right now, which is terrible. He wrote a book called The Scar of Race, which, his conclusion was that race-based admissions policies were deeply unpopular, and that people's opposition to them was much less malleable than their positions on almost any other public policy issue. And by the way, none of this has changed since 2003. Pew, Gallup, they pulled this over and over and over again. And every time, by at least 2-to-1 margins, Americans say, no, we do not want this. The most recent poll, one of them put out at the end of April 2022, say that carefully, showed 75% opposition. And not only 75% opposition, but that 75% opposition to the use of race broke down to supermajorities of every group analyzed, every race, every ethnicity, every party. You had 58, I think it was 59% was the lowest threshold of any group analyzed opposed. So no population actually wants this thing that our elites are pushing on us. And our laws against it, so that as long as we're willing to stand up and do something about it, we will get there. So like we're not suing yet. We're preparing to sue a number of the corporations that I've mentioned. We've demanded their officers and directors take down illegal policies, and we've done it on behalf of the shareholders whose money is at stake. Look, when those companies get sued by people they're discriminating against, and eventually someone will, or a government will, because there are lots of federal agencies and there are lots of state agencies that have the authority to do so, and eventually someone will. And when they do, they're gonna win. So when that happens, when the corporations lose, who pays? Because if the state of Texas, say, sues Starbucks for discriminating in hiring and promotions, Starbucks pays, by which I mean Starbucks shareholders pay. The officers and directors don't pay. They don't really, okay, I'm sure they'd rather have higher profits so that they can report them, but they've apparently decided other things are more important. So what we're doing is suing on behalf of shareholders, because the shareholders, in fact, do have the right to tell the officers and directors who work for them, you don't get to break the law with my money. You can't take my retirement and throw it away because it makes you feel good and lets you pose as virtuous with your friends later. That's not how this works. It's a fiduciary breach. It's an ultra vires act. It's illegal. And by the way, you personally are going to have to come out of pocket and reimburse the company for the harm you've done to it and to us. I do think this is going to work. I do think that and all of the other approaches that are out there, eventually, as the sheep makes its way through the snake, by the end of this, it'll be very clear that all of this is illegal, that in the conflict between what the American people mean by fairness and what their so-called betters mean by fairness, eventually America and Americans are going to win because the law is on our side and we're uniform and a republic, and finally we get to say, not them.
Okay. So I said that was last question, but I lied. I'm sorry. Just one more. Do you think that this could be part of the end of woke corporatism in general? Because this is just one part of woke corporatism. The other part of it is all the virtue signaling and all the other stuff that they do to pretend that they care about minorities. Do you think that this may also be part of the end of that, eventually down the line?
Look, there are some similar issues that are going to be involved. And yes, I hope that all of those issues will eventually sort their way out and to us having officers and directors of corporations who get back to understanding that their job is to run a corporation and to be profitable, and that anything else you want to do, it's not your money and it's not your choice. And it's going to take some doing to get from here to there. But this is certainly an example of it, and I hope we're helping.
Good. Well, I appreciate you joining me. We got to do this again because there's so much more to this. But in the meantime, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Absolutely. So the American Civil Rights Project, our website is www.americancivilrightsproject.org. It's very creative. Find us, please. We would love to have your help. We would love to have any tips you have of well-documented illegal policies, or just donations, or however people feel they can help. We would welcome.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for joining, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.